The vibration didn't just rattle the bone, it stripped the teeth of every gear inside the drive housing. Alina Vesper slammed her palm onto the manual override, a move calculated not in minutes, but in the 18 remaining seconds until the Athelred station became structural dust against the stellar debris field. The core chamber air, thin and heavy with ozone, tasted of reused sweat and imminent annihilation. She was ignoring 5 simultaneous system warnings, 4 of them flashing crimson, 1 screaming a bright, damning yellow. Reaction mass critical. But critical was still something. 0 was inevitable. Her focus narrowed down to the gauge that measured the remaining cycling capacity of the station's water filtration reservoir, the grey water, the sludge. Everything meant to sustain the 1,200 inhabitants for the next 7 months. That mass was now being violently diverted. It wasn't designed for propulsion, but she was a salvage engineer. And salvage systems always obeyed the same immutable truth. Momentum conservation was the only god that answered prayers instantly. She braced against the shuddering bulkhead, her knuckles white. The station was protesting, a low metallic groan that resonated less like a structure under stress and more like a dying animal forced to consume its own tail. The Xylosians, the alien architects of this derelict haven, had designed their station for sublime, fuelless motion, a masterpiece of non-Newtonian grace, coupling energy fields in ways humans had never fully grasped. Alina had always distrusted that subtle elegance. When the Xylosian drives failed, they didn't fail violently. They failed unpredictably, silently shifting the Ethelred into a slow, inexorable decay toward the kill zone. Now, her improvised engine, a crude arrangement of salvage mining thrusters rerouted through the station's own waste stream, fired. For every ton of recycled liquid expelled in a directed burst, an equal and opposite reaction nudged the colossal structure away from its doom. It was brute force physics, undeniable and vulgar, yet it worked. A jarring, sickening lurch ripped through the core, followed by sudden, impossible silence. The debris passed 100 meters away, the echo of high-speed shrapnel kissing the outer hull like a spray of metallic rain. Alina slumped, feeling the rapid drop in pressure, not in the drive chamber, but in her own chest. She had done it. They were safe. The Ethelred now held a perfectly stable, safe orbit, rendered untouchable by the cosmic mechanics of the debris path. But the cost was already screaming in the readout. 0 viable reserve mass. The system didn't display the volume in liters or kilograms. It displayed the expected viable sustainment time for the colony's closed ecosystem. The number on the screen, previously a solid 210 days, now flashed with furious, frantic zeros. A wave of nausea hit her, a physical consequence of the sudden change in vector and the realization of what she had done. She thought of the Xylosian engineers, their advanced logic that sought to escape the limitations of mass and reaction, achieving perpetual motion until one single tiny human error had rendered their flawless physics useless. She, the salvage tech, had solved the immediate problem by reducing physics to its most fundamental barbaric state. She had bought them safety by guaranteeing their future thirst. Report. The voice of Tavian Carr, the station's acting commander and chief habitat officer, crackled through the comm unit, tight with strained relief. Alina reached for the microphone, her hand trembling slightly. She was 30 years old, specialized in the dirty work of maintaining systems that should have been retired a generation ago. She believed in the Newtonian clockwork of the universe, action, reaction, the elegance of certainty. We cleared the path, Tavian. Vector change is nominal. Stable orbit confirmed. Thank the void, Tavian sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 1,200 souls. What was that spike? The energy readout was non-standard, almost primitive. Alina looked at the 0. The screen was still flashing, accusing her. She had to phrase this carefully, using the language of engineering to hide the language of survival. I utilized the station's tertiary fluid recycling capacity as reaction mass for the impulse burn. The Xylosian attitude thrusters weren't sufficient to handle the required delta V in that time frame, Commander. I had to expel stored mass. Silence stretched across the comms, a heavy cold vacuum more terrifying than the roar of the thrusters had been. Tavian was a physicist, a man who understood the concept of a closed ecosystem better than anyone. He didn't need the simple number of days to understand the 0. The entire water mass necessary to sustain the colony for the next 7 months. The Xylosians had created a habitat that was a fortress against the outside, relying on the internal perfection of its recycling loops. Water was oxygen, water was energy, water was life. It was the only viable reaction mass they had left after the derelict systems failed. Alina hadn't just used water. She had used the colony's future momentum to ensure its immediate past. "Alina," Tavian finally whispered, his voice dangerously low. "How much reaction mass did you use? Give me the volume reading." She gripped the microphone tighter. She could lie, or she could use the cold, technical truth that was worse than any lie. The choice was not between saving and damning. It was between immediate explosive death and a slow systemic collapse. And she, the technician, had made the choice for all of them. She remembered the fleeting moment of hesitation, less than half a second, right before her palm hit the override. A flicker of sheer selfish terror. If she hadn't acted, she would be dead too, but she wouldn't be guilty. That fleeting desire for release, for the simplicity of failure, had been the real sin. "Commander, the fluid reservoirs are showing minimum viable levels for biological filtering. We utilize 100% of the reserve grey water and treated sludge mass," she stated, her voice flat, emotionless. "The Ethelred is in a perfectly stable, non-decaying orbit." She waited for the fury, the accusation, the philosophical debate about the nature of survival versus viability. Instead, Tavian cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Understood, Vesper. You achieved the necessary displacement. You saved the station. Proceed with emergency atmospheric dehumidification protocols immediately. We need to reclaim every drop of vapor." He hadn't thanked her. He had simply given her a new impossible order. The implication was stark. They were already rationing the air they breathed for the moisture it contained. Alina slowly unlatched the safety harness. The smell of burned ozone was replaced by a sterile, acrid dryness that seemed to suck the moisture from her own sinuses. She looked around the engine core. The heat exchangers were still cooling, the metal bulkheads humming faintly. In the absolute vacuum of space, they were untouchable, perfectly preserved. But a perfectly preserved tomb was still a tomb. The elegance of Silosian physics, the non-Newtonian dream of perpetual motion, had failed because it neglected the most fundamental law of the universe that Alina respected above all others. You cannot get something from nothing. The Zelosians tried to cheat the universe by denying mass. Alina had brutally reminded the universe that mass was everything. She walked towards the main airlock, the floor plates feeling strangely heavy underfoot. The station was now free from the external threat, yet utterly constrained by its internal finite mass. This was the dark paradox of the closed system, a concept the colonists had always understood intellectually but were about to feel in their throats. She opened the pressure seal to the corridor. The low-frequency mechanical pulse of the recycling pumps, the heartbeat of the station, was gone. Only the thin synthetic whir of the life support backup fans remained. Standing there, framed in the corridor light, was a man she didn't know, dressed in the heavy, unadorned grey uniform of station security. His face was weathered, his eyes fixed not on her but on the gauge over her shoulder, the one that screamed 0. "Propulsion Tech Vesper," the man said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Commander Carr requests your immediate presence in Habitat Command." His lack of haste was chilling. He wasn't rushing her to receive accolades or even to face a tribunal. He was simply moving a piece on the board. Alina felt a metallic taste rising in her mouth, not of ozone this time, but of fear. She stepped out of the engine core and noticed how dry the man's uniform looked, how utterly pristine. She had just guaranteed their death sentence, and the security officer standing before her showed no signs of panic, only an icy, practiced restraint. He didn't move to guide her or block her path. He simply stood, a statue of quiet authority. 7 months, Alina murmured, looking past him down the empty, echoing corridor. "That's how long we had," the security man finished for her, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were sharp, assessing, and utterly unforgiving. "Now we have maybe 3 days if the humidifiers work overtime. You saved us today, Vesper. Now the rest of us get to find out what kind of life you traded our future for." He turned, leading the way toward the command hub. Alina followed, the weight of the Ethelred pressing down on her shoulders. She recognized the sharp, efficient gait of the officer, the subtle placement of his hands. It wasn't the walk of a security guard. It was the precision of military training, special operations, something highly disciplined and heavily suppressed. But the most disturbing part wasn't his competence. It was the fact that she had worked on the Ethelred for 4 years. She knew every soul in the habitat, every technician, every officer, every civilian. and she had never seen this man before. The walk to the command hub was unnervingly brief. Alina could already feel the synthetic air pulling moisture from her nasal passages, the telltale sign of the emergency dehumidification protocols working exactly as designed to suck sustenance from the very atmosphere. The metallic taste of fear lingered, but it was overlaid by a sharp, acrid dryness, like licking cold steel. The unknown security officer, Kane, moved with an efficiency that was profoundly disturbing in the slack civilian-run Ethelred. His boots hit the floor plates with the same measured cadence, regardless of the incline or decline of the corridor. Alina watched his back, realizing he hadn't wasted a single movement since he appeared. He was a singularity of controlled force in a habitat defined by entropy. They entered the command hub. The room, usually a low hum of monitoring screens and muted discussions, was silent except for the frantic clicking of Tavian Carr's keyboard. The commander sat hunched over his console, his grey hair mussed, his face pale under the cold monitor light. The massive holographic display that dominated the room was now projecting the habitat's internal fluid topology, a chaotic mesh of red lines signifying critical failure. Tavian looked up, his eyes bloodshot, seeing Alina not as a savior, but as the inevitable consequence of a failed equation. Vesper, status report on the immediate water reclaim cycle, he ordered, skipping any pretense of ceremony or accusation. Commander, the protocols are running, but the Xylosian filtering matrices are not holding the pressure from the vapor intake. The throughput is already dropping exponentially. They were designed for equilibrium, not violent reclamation. I know what they were designed for, Tavian snapped, rubbing his temples. I need data, not philosophy. Can we reroute the heat exchangers to boost the condensation rate? If we reroute the primary exchangers, we risk crystallization in the matrices, instant shutdown. Their structural tolerance is microscopic. We need time, Tavian. We need a slow, controlled ramp-up. Kane stepped forward, placing a datapad on the console without a sound. It displayed a graph of atmospheric pressure, sinking steadily. Commander, time is no longer a variable. We have utilized the atmosphere itself as our first reserve tank. We must choose between maintaining acceptable oxygen levels and maximizing moisture recapture. The curve dictates rapid action, not control. Tavian ignored Kane, focusing on Alina. Override the safety protocols, Vesper. Force the phase coupling. If the matrices can be forced to a higher yield for 12 hours, we can pull back maybe 30% of the expended mass. Alina hesitated, a physical tightening in her throat. This was the core conflict of her existence, the elegant theory of Xylosian design, which promised perfection if operated delicately, versus the brute force certainty of human necessity. She knew the override would fail. It would be a catastrophic loss of the most complex, irreplaceable components. But to refuse was to admit total defeat. Show them the cost of complexity. A cynical voice echoed in her mind. She accessed the console, her hands surprisingly not trembling now. The fear was replaced by cold professional justification. She input the complex sequence, bypassing 3 layers of safety code. The holographic water map pulsed violently, changing from red to an impossible searing white. A low hiss permeated the room, a sound like steam escaping a fracture. For exactly 42 seconds, the yield shot up. The condensation gauge soared. Then, with a brittle crystalline crack that resonated through the floor plates, the holographic graph dissolved into a cascade of error messages. The filtering matrices were irrevocably fused, the complex Xylosian architecture collapsing into brittle, useless slag. Tavian stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, a silent scream hanging in the tense, dehydrated air. Irreversible system damage, Kane stated, his voice flat reading the readout. Recapture capability now 0.0%. Estimated sustainable duration reduced to 36 hours, factoring in physiological demand. Alina looked at the ruin of the Xylosian technology. She felt no satisfaction, only the heavy, familiar weight of guilt, not for the failure itself, but for the inherent fatal flaw she kept exposing in everything they relied on. 4 years ago, that same flawed elegance had killed Dr. Ilara. Ilara, her mentor, had believed in the non-Newtonian perfection of the Ethelred's initial infrastructure. She died when a subtle phase coupler, designed for perpetual low-energy maintenance, destabilized and collapsed the research wing, vaporizing the water supply in the sector instantly. Ilara focused on the subtle beauty of the theory, ignored the brutal certainty of thermodynamics. Alina, hiding in a Newtonian-era emergency bunker, had watched the vapor cloud rise. She survived, but carried the shame of prioritizing crude certainty over intellectual bravery. That shame fueled her distrust. She was alive because she was a cynic, a salvage tech who only trusted what she could smash and rebuild. Now, Tavian finally lifted his head, his eyes fixing on Kane, not Alina. Kane, the rationing schedule. Implement Phase 3 immediately. Double shifts on the oxygen recyclers. We stabilize the air. Phase 3 requires 2 additional security personnel for enforcement, Commander, Kane replied, his focus already on the logistics, not the crisis. The civilian population will resist the shift in atmospheric priority. Then you recruit them, Tavian whispered, sounding exhausted, defeated. Do whatever is necessary. Kane nodded once, a gesture so precise it felt like a signature. He didn't engage in the melodrama. He simply processed the new reality. His presence was the sudden, cold realization that this was no longer a community crisis. It was a resource conflict, and he was the arbiter of force. Alina felt marginalized, her technical failure overshadowed by the new political necessity. She needed a new angle, a way to re-establish the primacy of engineering over martial law. Tavian, with the dehumidification cycle dead, we are back to basics, Alina interjected, cutting through the rising tension. The problem is reaction mass, but the solution is still mass. We can't replicate water, but we can find it. Tavian stared blankly. Find it where? We are kilometers from any viable celestial body, and our drives are spent. The external mining sector, Sector 4, Alina said, pointing to an old, largely forgotten schematic on a lower panel. The Zelosian miners extracted volatiles for their heavy industrial process. We always assumed the shafts were purged, but there were persistent rumors among the maintenance crews. Old ice deposits deep in the derelict core. Pure primordial water ice trapped in micro-pockets. Tavian's expression shifted from despair to skeptical scrutiny. Vesper. That sector hasn't been cycled for 30 years. The atmosphere is thin, pressurized by residual argon. The structural integrity is questionable. We need a reaction mass, Commander, not a habitat. We go in, we harvest, we bring back enough ice to fire the main engines for a minimal vector change toward a rendezvous point. A rendezvous point? Kane interjected, speaking directly to Alina for the first time since their tense arrival. His voice was low, carrying a strange echo of metallic resonance. That is dependent on external contact. Do you still believe we can transmit a distress signal? Alina nodded, her certainty shaky but determined. We can reconfigure the high-power sensor array? Kane shook his head slowly, a minute dismissive movement. Unnecessary. The Zylosian comm system relies on a subtle, high-band phase coupling to breach the local energy null zones. It doesn't require sheer power. It requires precision only the alien drives could supply. The simple truth, Vesper, is that your successful move placed the Ethelred not merely into a safe orbit, but into an orbit designed specifically to evade detection. This is not a random piece of space, Commander. Our current position is a gravitational singularity known in deep space mapping as the Cloister. Tavian frowned. The Cloister? That's ancient history. A theoretical trap for hostile vessels. It is real, Kane confirmed, pulling up a new overlay. The station's location was marked dead center within a complex, interlocking mesh of gravitational and energy fields. Any craft attempting to approach us using standard Zylosian or Federation hyperjump drives will be automatically diverted outward. The debris field you bypassed was merely the outer ring of the station's natural defense mechanism. The ultimate defense is isolation. Alina stared at the screen, the nausea returning. Her Newtonian necessity, her brute force expulsion of mass, had saved them from immediate physical impact, only to perfectly seal them within a sophisticated technological cage designed for non-contact. She hadn't just used their water. She had rendered them permanently untouchable. The problem was not 3 days of thirst. The problem was eternal isolation. We cannot transmit, and we cannot be reached, Tavian summarized, his voice hollow. Precisely, Kane agreed. So the ice is not for rescue. It is for survival. If you can scavenge enough mass for a single controlled burn, Vesper, you can use that reaction mass to push us out of the Cloister, far enough for a standard distress call to punch through. Alina grasped the gravity of the choice. Going into Sector 4 was the only option, but it meant spending their last atmospheric sealant to secure the airlock against the highly corrosive argon atmosphere in the shaft. It was a one-way attempt. She reached for the climbing harness hanging near the console, checking the heavy magnetic clamps. Kane moved simultaneously, his hand stopping hers, not with force, but with a firm, professional grip. I will accompany you, he said. You are needed here for rationing enforcement, Alina countered, pulling her hand away. The commander has delegated. And I know Sector 4, Vesper, Kane repeated, his eyes fixing on hers, cold and clear. He lifted a heavy-duty mining laser from a nearby weapons rack. The laser was Federation standard issue, not civilian mining equipment. That sector was designated a restricted military acquisition zone before the Xylosians left. It was never intended for civilian volatiles. The maps you have are incomplete. I know its layout, Vesper. I know its traps. The implications were chilling. Kane wasn't just a new security officer. He was a ghost of a buried conflict, a soldier positioned in this forgotten corner of the void, waiting for a crisis he was trained to handle. He hadn't been put on the Ethelred by Tavian Carr. He was already here. What were they acquiring, Kane? Alina asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked past her toward the airlock, the sterile light making his features sharp and unforgiving. Not water, Vesper. They were acquiring certainty. The airlock cycled with a wrenching finality, sealing the colony's last atmospheric sealant behind them. The drop in temperature was immediate and brutal, a frigid shock that even the heavy-duty environmental suits struggled to neutralize. This was not the recycled chill of the habitat. This was the vacuum seeping through derelict kilometers-long bulkheads, smelling of metallic decay and residual argon, the highly corrosive element that gave Sector 4 its forgotten toxic reputation. They moved quickly down the main extraction shaft, the massive space echoing with the slight friction of their boots and the faint hiss of their life support systems struggling against the pressure differential. Alina's headlight cut through the thick haze, revealing Xylosian architecture on a scale she had only ever seen in salvaged fragments, geometric, unnecessarily ornate, and built to withstand eons. Kane moved ahead, his heavy-duty laser rifle held ready, scanning not for structural weakness but for entry points only military engineers would know. The old maps indicate the largest micropocket is 3 kilometers down, Alina reported, her voice thin over the internal comms. The structural reports rate this column as 50% viable. The reports are wrong, Vesper, Kane stated without slowing. The Xylosian structure is functionally intact. It is the human additions, the scaffolding and secondary braces that are compromised. Follow my path. He veered abruptly, abandoning the main shaft for a narrow maintenance duct. Alina hesitated for a microsecond. Her navigation overlay screamed structural instability, but Kane's certainty was unnerving. She followed, squeezing her suit through the tight passage. They emerged into a vast cavern, a secondary access tunnel hidden deep within the main column. The air here was drier, colder, the argon pressure almost overwhelming. And there, against the far wall, was a faint sheen of white, the primordial ice deposit. There, Alina whispered, a sudden fierce hope surging through her. It was enough. Maybe enough for 3 full vector changes. She activated the heavy magnetic clamps on her boots, crossing the uneven metal floor toward the deposit. She intended to set up the sonic bore, taking small controlled samples to minimize structural disturbance. Stop, Vesper. Kane's voice was a low command. The structural reports are wrong, but so are the rumors. This isn't a deposit. Alina stopped 2 meters from the shimmering surface. It's ice, Kane. Pure crystallized mass. It's a lure, he countered, raising his laser rifle and firing a short, precise burst at a point 10 meters above the ice. The Xylosian alloy designed to withstand deep space collision fractured instantly, revealing not metal, but a web of intricate humming conduits. The conduits glowed briefly, and a segment of the cavern floor beneath the ice deposit dropped away with a sickening groan, a massive segment of rock tumbling into the abyss below. Alina felt a wash of nauseating vertigo. That was where she would have placed the sonic bore anchoring the operation. The Xylosians were not collectors of resources, Vesper, Kane said, lowering his weapon. They were collectors of patterns. They engineered this instability to detect the desperation of other species. If you went for the ice immediately, you proved your desperation, and this entire section would have sealed, cutting you off. Alina stared at the sheer drop, her heart pounding. The structural cost was immediate. Her main access path to the ice was gone. She had lost her footing and her confidence, both simultaneously. She cursed her own intellectual humility, her belief that if she just respected the basic physics, the high-level alien engineering wouldn't matter. She had been wrong. There is another pocket, Alina muttered, adjusting her internal console. She quickly located the secondary deposit, smaller but theoretically accessible via a lateral maintenance crawl space. It's 30 minutes away. We used the bypass. Kane nodded, not arguing but not praising either. He led the way, his movement economical, inhumanly precise. The traverse through the lateral crawl space was agonizing. The cold intensified, and Alina's suit warning light began flashing a soft amber, minor pressure leakage. She had spent their last sealant securing the main airlock. They had no reserve for suit repair. The corrosive argon was eating into her outer lining. Her chest tightened, the strain causing her to feel dizzy, a cold sweat forming beneath the helmet despite the frigid air. They reached the secondary deposit. It was a shallow pool of solidified vapor, barely enough mass for a single minimal burn, certainly not enough to push them clear of the cloister. But it was something. Alina pulled out her handheld sonic pick. This required less power than the bore, minimizing vibrations. She needed precision. We have maybe 20 minutes before the ambient argon compromises the integrity of our seals, Alina stated, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Kane said nothing, scanning the cavern wall with his rifle beam. Alina began harvesting, the sonic pick emitting a high-pitched whine that grated on her nerves. The ice broke cleanly, scattering fragments that she quickly suctioned into the containment canisters. Just keep moving. Just keep the physics simple. After 5 minutes, she had secured maybe 15% of the necessary mass. Then Kane moved, his motion violent and sudden. "Behind you," he yelled, pushing Alina hard against the wall. She slammed against the metal, the impact jarring her ribs and spiking the pressure warning in her visor to a furious red. She felt the sudden, terrifying sensation of static electricity building up in the air around them. Where Kane had been standing, a thin, almost invisible beam of energy sliced through the air. It wasn't a weapon. It was a scanner, highly focused. And emanating from the wall was a small three-pronged device, previously invisible against the Xylosian architecture. A Sentinel drone. "It's not armed," Alina gasped, checking her own suit for structural failure. "It doesn't need to be," Kane replied, his voice strained. "That is a Xylosian high-band stress emitter. It monitors the biosignatures of non-native organisms. It's analyzing your panic, Vesper, your physiological response to the environment." Alina realized the truth of the trap. The Sentinel wasn't guarding the ice, it was recording the need for the ice. The elegant logic of the aliens. If an organism resorted to this dangerous, toxic depth, it was acting out of necessity, an unstable variable that must be eliminated. If we continue harvesting, we prove our necessity, and the Sentinel transmits a full defense activation signal, Alina summarized, the failure hitting her like a physical blow. Precisely. That signal triggers the phase coupling that seals the cloister permanently and likely destabilizes the Ethelred's primary habitat loop. Alina's attempt to escape isolation using brute force had led her to a place where brute force was the trigger for annihilation. She felt the heavy, cold weight of her shame returning. She was so focused on the certainty of Newton that she ignored the system-wide consequences of Xylosian design. The Sentinel continued its silent scan, the faint hum of its emitter rising in frequency. "We have to destroy it," Alina said, raising the sonic pick, preparing to use it as a makeshift weapon. "You hit it, you activate the distress signal instantaneously. The Xylosians programmed redundancy into their systems. That drone is just a relay." Kane raised his rifle, aiming a hair's breadth away from the Sentinel. "I could try to disable its broadcast antenna with a precision shot, but the electromagnetic pulse from the shot will compromise the local environmental controls." Alina understood the new terrible dilemma. If they destroyed the Sentinel with conventional force, they brought down the full defensive grid. If Kane attempted the precision shot, they risked power failure in the already unstable Sector 4. Then a new sound reached them over the comms, faint and metallic, a scraping, shuffling noise coming from the tunnel they had just traversed. The sound was too slow, too heavy to be structural collapse. "Movement detected," Kane stated, turning his focus from the Sentinel to the tunnel entrance. "Humanoid, heavy armor." "Rationing enforcement," Alina realized, her voice tight. "Kane, you said you were delegated. You didn't say you were part of the enforcement team." Kane didn't answer immediately. He was listening to the approach. "They're closing rapidly. 1 unit." Alina quickly calculated. If the unit captured them, the ice was lost, and Kane would simply report failure, consolidating his tactical position in the command hub. This was not just a rescue mission. It was a test of loyalty and competence, and she was failing both. She had to make a choice that relied purely on her skill, disregarding the elegant Xylosian physics and accepting the maximal risk. She gripped the sonic pick. "We can't shoot it. We can't wait," Alina said, her voice dropping to a decisive register. "It's a Xylosian high-band device. We need to override it with something vulgar. Something completely off-design." She adjusted the sonic pick's output, twisting the phase control to maximum, bypassing the dampeners. It was an improvised EMP, crude and highly localized. It was the engineering equivalent of spitting on a masterwork. "That will fry every local system in 300 meters, Vesper," Kane warned, his tone flat but urgent. "Including their comms and their armor's environmental controls. It buys us time." She slammed the sonic pick against the Sentinel. The resulting sound was not a bang, but a sharp, sickening thwack, followed by a blinding burst of white static electricity. Alina felt the current slam into her suit. Her vision whited out for 2 agonizing seconds, and when it returned, the pressure gauge on her wrist was flashing black. Full internal system failure. The Sentinel was silent. The faint humming conduits in the cavern roof winked out. Total power loss in the immediate area. "Status report," Kane yelled, his own comms crackling with static. "Full system outage on my suit," Alina reported, sucking dry air. "We have maybe 3 minutes of reserve oxygen before filtering fails. We have to move now." She grabbed the containment canisters, securing the partial hull of ice. They had maybe 20 kilograms, just barely enough. But Kane wasn't moving. He was staring at the now completely darkened cavern wall. "You didn't just disable the Sentinel, Vesper," Kane stated, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all professionalism. "The primary Xylosian supports for this entire mining column operate on subtle energy coupling, not crude mechanical struts. You just introduced a system-wide shockwave into structures designed for absolute equilibrium." A deep metallic grinding sound started, slow at first, then accelerating into a deafening tearing shriek. The ground beneath them started to tremble violently, not with the shudder of a thruster, but the deep, irreversible tearing of metal under geological stress. The Xylosian certainty was that no one would ever violate their physics, Kane said, his eyes now blazing with tactical terror. "You proved them wrong. You just triggered a complete structural collapse of Sector 4. We are trapped. Vesper. The Argon atmosphere is about to become 1,000 tons of collapsing debris." Alina looked down at the 20 kilograms of precious ice in her hands. She had secured the mass needed for their escape burn, but the price was immediate, unavoidable burial. She had successfully exposed the fatal flaw in the elegant Xylosian design, only to be crushed by the brute certainty of Newtonian gravity. The seismic tearing intensified, roaring around them like a hungry animal. The seismic tearing accelerated into a blinding, deafening climax. The sound was the death cry of engineered stability, the Xylosian materials failing under the sudden vulgar shockwave of Alina's EMP. Debris, large enough to crush the crawler, rained down from the columns above. Alina scrambled back. 20 kilograms of ice mass clutched to her chest, her suit flashing red then black. "We have to move," she yelled over the internal comms, though the feedback was mostly static and high-pitched whine. Kane grabbed her arm, not in partnership but with the cold, efficient grip of a handler securing cargo. He didn't look up at the collapsing ceiling. He looked past her toward the incoming enforcement unit, which was now visible, its heavy armor plate glinting through the thick argon haze. "Hold position, Vesper," Kane ordered, his voice slicing through the chaos, somehow perfectly modulated despite the seismic roar. "We have 3 seconds before the primary column gives." Instead of retreating, Kane pulled Alina forward toward a barely visible crevice in the wall, a utility port marked "Caution, High Energy Coupling." He shoved her into the narrow gap just as the roof above exploded outward in a cascade of twisted metal. The force of the blast ripped the sonic pick from her hand. Alina braced, coughing into the failing atmosphere of her helmet. When the debris settled, the cavern was choked with particulate matter, and the entrance to the maintenance tunnel they had used was completely sealed. The armored unit was now standing 10 meters away, frozen by the collapse, but intact. It was a single soldier wearing Federation standard heavy tactical gear. A standard security officer wouldn't possess this armor, and certainly wouldn't be operating kilometers deep in a derelict toxic zone. "Status report Alpha 7, Kane transmitted, his voice sharp and formal, completely devoid of the tense cooperation they had shared moments before. The armored soldier straightened instantly, snapping a salute that felt grotesque in the middle of a structural collapse. Agent Carr's request acknowledged. Commander Kane, mass secured. Vesper unit contained. Alina felt the cold realization seize her. Commander Kane. Not security officer. Not Tavian Carr's assistant. Commander. And his mission was not to enforce rationing, it was to secure the objective. The Vesper unit is not contained Alpha 7. She is necessary. Her unique comprehension of the salvaged Newtonian drives is essential for the extraction burn, Kane corrected, his attention finally settling on Alina, his eyes cold and calculating behind the visor. I used the collapse to isolate us from Carr's remaining personnel. The acting commander is proving politically unstable. Extraction burn? You're leaving? Alina struggled against his grip, the realization making her feel physically ill. You lied. You aren't here to enforce rationing. You were never part of the Ethelred crew. Kane nodded once, a minimal movement of professional affirmation. My presence was classified Vesper. I am assigned to the Ethelred project by Unified Command. The purpose of this habitat was never civilian. It was a testbed for Zylosian phase coupling technology. When that technology failed due to human error, the orbit decay you solved, Unified Command needed a guarantee of extraction. But Tavian said the station was sealed in the cloister, untouchable. Alina protested, her breath ragged. It is, Kane agreed, untouchable by sophisticated Zylosian technology, but not by brute force. We needed a catalyst, Vesper, someone who fundamentally distrusted the elegance of the Zylosian design, someone who would ignore the subtle laws of non-Newtonian physics and just hit the system with sheer vulgar Newtonian certainty. You were the only variable unpredictable enough to survive the initial traps and bypass the Sentinel drone. Alina stared at the 20 kilograms of ice mass in her hands. She had been the brute force they needed. Her engineering belief in simple action and reaction had been weaponized against the subtle, elegant defense mechanisms of the Ethelred. She hadn't saved them through brilliance. She had been used as a wrecking ball. The Sentinel was recording my physiological stress, wasn't it? Alina whispered, the words tasting like argon. It wasn't guarding the ice. It was guarding the knowledge that the ice existed. And my brute force solution, the EMP, wasn't just a violation. It was the ultimate proof of non-Zylosian necessity. The one thing guaranteed to collapse the structure designed for equilibrium. Precisely, Kane confirmed, a hint of admiration in his voice. You exposed the fatal flaw in their design. The certainty of Newtonian physics. I needed that flaw exposed to know the exact structural limits of the column. You sacrificed Sector 4, Alina spat, feeling the heavy metallic taste of guilt return. Collateral damage. The ice is secured. And now, Vesper, you will accompany me back to the command hub. You will install this reaction mass and perform the vector burn that punches us out of the cloister and into the Unified Command extraction path. He reached for the ice canisters. This was the moment of the impossible choice. If Alina cooperated, the colony would be saved from immediate dehydration and isolation. The price? She would be assisting a highly advanced military operation, one that clearly had covert designs on the Zylosian technology far beyond saving a few civilians. She would be an accessory to whatever dark purpose Kane represented. If she refused, Kane would likely execute her, secure the ice mass himself, and attempt the burn. But if she destroyed the mass now, they would all die of thirst, but Kane's mission would fail, and the Ethelred and its sophisticated, dangerous secrets would remain permanently isolated, a tomb protected from external exploitation. Does she choose the guaranteed death of 1,200 people to prevent the certainty of military enslavement? Or does she sacrifice her integrity to ensure their survival under Kane's authority? Kane's hand closed over the canister. I have 20 kilograms of mass, Vesper, enough to save the Ethelred, but you are the only one who can ensure the engine calibration is sufficient to bypass the gravity singularity. Your life, and the life of everyone on the station, depends on your cooperation. Alina felt the corrosive argon stinging the exposed skin around her visor seal. Her reserve oxygen warning light was now flashing red. 2 minutes remaining. She looked at Kane, seeing the brutal, unyielding logic of a man who only dealt in variables and certainties. He respected mass just like her. He just defined mass differently. Human lives were the soft, expendable variable. The 20 kilograms of ice were the certainty. She had to remind him that even the certainty of mass obeyed the law of irreversible destruction. Alina didn't pull the ice away. She didn't struggle physically. She brought her left hand up and slammed it with maximum force against the only functional device remaining in the cavern. The small metallic housing for Kane's internal comms unit, mounted high on his heavy shoulder armor. The contact was a small, focused act of Newtonian aggression. The comm unit fractured. Kane recoiled, momentarily stunned by the sudden, localized impact. What in the void? Reaction, Alina gasped, pushing against him with her entire body mass, leveraging the failing magnetic clamps on her boots. Equal and opposite. She wasn't aiming for Kane. She was aiming for the crevice he had forced them into. The utility port marked high energy coupling. She used the momentary imbalance to kick the 20 kilograms of ice mass not towards Kane, but deep into the narrow conduit, away from the immediate debris field. She secured the ice, not for consumption but for destruction. Kane's tactical calm dissolved. He understood instantly what she had done. The ice mass was now positioned directly over the primary phase coupling array. Any further structural instability or a deliberate detonation would vaporize the mass and destabilize the coupling, causing a critical failure far greater than the local collapse. He released her, moving with lightning speed toward the utility port. Alpha 7, secure the mass. Now. Alina had 1 minute of oxygen remaining. She didn't retreat. She turned her attention to the wall behind Kane, where the structural tearing was most acute. She could hear the final shriek of the metal, the moment of definitive failure. She reached for the fractured comm unit on Kane's shoulder and ripped the remaining components free. With her last physical strength, she jammed the exposed wires into the nearest humming conduit, a loose Xylosian power line designed for microscopic energy coupling. It was the ultimate expression of vulgar engineering, using a high-band communications array to short a subtle Xylosian power conduit. The consequence was instantaneous and terrifying. A spike of pure raw energy surged into the collapsing column. Instead of merely sealing the breach, the shockwave amplified the structural failure. The entire ceiling of the cavern above them began to fall, not in pieces but in a cohesive continental sheet of metal. Kane realized the gravity of her final act of sabotage. She had successfully exchanged the certainty of their survival for the immediate preservation of the station's isolation. "You sacrificed them for nothing, Vesper," Kane roared, turning from the ice mass toward Alina, his laser rifle raised. The armored soldier, Alpha 7, reacted with trained professionalism, targeting the falling debris. Kane focused on the immediate threat, Alina. Before Kane could fire, the metal sheet tore free, slamming down between them. The impact was cataclysmic, a soundless thunder that threw Alina violently backward, extinguishing the last flicker of light in her visor. She felt the heavy pressure of debris pinning her legs. Total darkness, total silence, save for the dry, rasping pull of her final reserve oxygen tank. 50 seconds. Then a faint, tiny red light pulsed in her black visor, the light of her internal navigation system, which had survived the EMP. It wasn't showing her location. It was displaying a newly received data packet, transmitted from Kane's fractured comms unit in the instant before the impact. It wasn't a military report. It was a single archived Xylosian schematic, a design overlay of the Ethelred's architecture. The schematic showed Sector 4, but highlighted in searing red was not the ice deposit, but the conduit she had just shorted. The text below the schematic read, "Xylosian phase coupling, primary power core bypass, access point, Sector 4. Warning, activation guarantees irreversible energy field inversion, locking the cloister from within." Alina hadn't just destroyed the station's hope of a rescue burn. She had triggered the Xylosian self-sealing mechanism, turning the entire Ethelred into a prison. They were safe from the debris, safe from Kane, but permanently isolated. 30 seconds of oxygen remaining. She was trapped, entombed under tons of debris, paralyzed by the realization that her Newtonian necessity had perfectly completed the Xylosian design for ultimate eternal non-contact. She was utterly alone, save for the faint red glow of a schematic that promised perpetual unyielding isolation. But the light of the schematic was not entirely red. Nestled deep within the Xylosian diagram was a secondary tiny blue beacon, an overlay Kane had inadvertently given her access to, a manual bypass, and next to it, a single cryptic human designation, Davian Carr. "Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal." A sensação que despertou Alina não foi de dor, mas de uma asfixia revertida. O oxigênio sintético invadiu seus pulmões com uma urgência estéril e seca, limpando o resíduo cáustico de argônio que quase a matou. Alguém havia puxado seu corpo debaixo dos escombros, não por clemência, mas por cálculo. Quando sua visão se estabilizou, a escuridão absoluta da mina de gelo havia sido substituída pela luz fria e implacável do Command Hub. Ela não estava na ponte principal. Estava confinada em uma baía de engenharia lateral, separada por um vidro temperado como um espécime de laboratório. Suas pernas estavam presas em talas metálicas de emergência. O peso do metal caído em Sector 4 havia garantido que ela não se movesse por conta própria por um bom tempo. O corpo dela, o motor de ação e reação que ela tanto confiava, havia traído sua vontade. Na ponte de comando, Tavian Carr estava algemado e imóvel, sentado sob vigilância direta de Alpha 7. O centro nervoso da Ethelred havia sido tomado. Kane entrou na baía de engenharia, seu traje de campo substituído por um uniforme de comando cinza escuro, impecavelmente limpo. Ele não demonstrava pressa nem raiva, apenas a fria satisfação da certeza tática. "Bem-vinda de volta à funcionalidade, Vesper", ele disse, sua voz amplificada desprovida de qualquer calor. 72 quilos de escombros. Seus ferimentos são graves, mas você não morrerá. Nossos recursos são limitados, e o comando a considera infelizmente insubstituível. Alina tentou se levantar. A dor a atingiu com a força de um choque elétrico, forçando-a de volta ao assento. O ferimento na perna não era o pior. Era a sensação constante de desobediência em seus próprios músculos, a reação atrasada do sistema nervoso ao comando cerebral. "O gelo", Alina sibilou, sentindo o gosto metálico de sangue na boca. "Vaporizado", Kane confirmou com desinteresse. Ele gesticulou para uma tela que mostrava a assinatura de energia da explosão em Sector 4. Seu ato final de sabotagem garantiu que a massa necessária para a fuga fosse destruída. E mais importante, garantiu que a phase coupling fosse ativada irreversivelmente. Você completou a prisão gilosiana, Vesper. O Ethelred está perfeitamente selado. Ele virou o monitor para ela, revelando o mesmo diagrama que seu visor piscou no último momento. O esquema de defesa de The Cloister, agora totalmente ativo. Você viu este diagrama no meu feed fragmentado. O Shilosiano sabia que a única ameaça real à sua elegância era a intervenção de outra espécie. Kane explicou, caminhando pelo perímetro da baía. Eles projetaram um sistema onde o ato de intervenção, o uso de força bruta, sua amada física newtoniana, se tornasse o gatilho para a reclusão permanente. Você foi o martelo que eles esperavam. Você provou a necessidade, e eles ativaram a armadilha final. Alina sentiu o peso da vergonha esmagando-a. Ela pensou que estava expondo a falha no design alienígena. Na verdade, ela havia executado a última fase do plano de defesa deles. Sua certeza tinha sido usada contra ela. Você tem 40 horas de água potável no circuito de reserva. Não 72 dias. 40 horas. Kane continuou, a voz um bisturi afiado. Sua sabotagem eliminou a esperança de extração e acelerou a desidratação terminal da colônia. Alina olhou para Tavian Carr através do vidro. O comandante, que havia lutado tanto para manter a ordem, parecia um fantasma, sua cabeça baixa em aceitação. E agora? Qual é o seu plano, Kane? Processar o restante da água para consumo pessoal até a extração? Kane sorriu. Um movimento frio e desagradável. Eu não sou Tavian Carr, Vesper. Eu não nego a realidade. A extração está fora de questão, mas a sobrevivência é um imperativo. Seu talento, Vesper, reside na engenharia de salvação. Você falhou em obter a massa para essa reação, mas ainda pode salvar a colônia. Ele apontou para o console à sua frente. Você tem o diagrama Shilosiano. Você viu o que o seu EMP revelou. O Power Core Bypass. A mesma linha que você cortou para selar o Ethelred é a linha que pode, com a calibração precisa, estabilizar o que resta da filtragem de ar e umidade. Seu trabalho agora é reverter o dano. Transformar a falha que você causou em um sistema de suporte de vida brutalmente eficiente. Você usará essa energia da phase coupling para alimentar as bombas de ar. Alina entendeu a obscenidade. Kane estava forçando-a a reverter o curso, a se tornar a arquiteta do sistema de isolamento que ela acabara de criar. Ela teria que usar o poder da prisão shilosiana para manter a colônia viva, prolongando a agonia em vez de garantir a liberdade. Eu me recuso, Alina disse, a palavra ecoando secamente na baía. Kane inclinou a cabeça estudando-a. Recusar? O que você tem a ganhar? Você lutou para evitar que o comando unificado obtivesse a tecnologia shilosiana. Agora, por sua própria ação, a tecnologia está trancada aqui, Seu único ato de resistência resultou na morte garantida de seus 1.200 vizinhos. Sua moralidade não serviu a ninguém, Vesper. Foi apenas arrogância técnica. Ele se aproximou do vidro e, por um momento, Alina viu algo além da frieza militar. Um entendimento sombrio e filosófico. Eu entendo a sua crença na certeza, Vesper. Mas você se concentrou tanto na certeza da terceira lei, que ignorou a certeza da entropia. Seus princípios a levaram a aniquilar a única chance de sobrevivência. É hora de confrontar quem você realmente é. Alina fechou os olhos, sentindo o peso da culpa se manifestar como náusea. Ela não era uma heroína tentando salvar a todos. Era uma técnica de salvamento que só confiava em sistemas falhos e métodos desesperados. Ela estava viva porque era uma cínica, e agora seu cinismo tinha condenado 1.200 almas. Ela não queria admitir isso, mas a matemática fria de Kane era inegável. Kane não esperou por uma resposta. Ele ativou o console. A contagem regressiva para a falha do filtro de ar começa agora, 40 horas. Seu trabalho é começar a integrar o Power Core Bypass. Se não o fizer, Alpha 7 tem ordens para desativar a circulação de ar na ala de moradia. Escolha. Morra de sede em 40 horas. Ou comece a trabalhar para prolongar a vida deles, um dia de cada vez, sob minha supervisão. A chantagem era perfeita. Não era sobre salvar-se, mas sobre a recusa em participar do assassinato em massa. Alina se inclinou sobre o console, sua testa suada contra o metal frio. Sua mente, antes um motor de cálculo limpo, estava lenta, turva pela dor e pela exaustão. Ela começou a digitar os comandos de integração. Por 10 minutos, ela trabalhou, realocando o poder do Cloyster para as bombas de ar. Cada linha de código era uma confissão de sua derrota moral. Então, sua visão vacilou, e o pequeno ponto azul que ela havia vislumbrado no diagrama chilociano no momento do colapso reapareceu. Não estava no feed ativo que Kane estava monitorando, mas no buffer de memória temporária que o EMP de seu comunicador havia forçado para o sistema. O ponto azul era um sensor chilosiano de alta frequência, marcado no diagrama com o rótulo humano. Manual Override. High Band Sensor Array. Alina tinha presumido que o chilociano Comm System era inútil, como Kane havia dito, incapaz de perfurar The Cloyster. Mas o sensor Array de alta frequência, posicionado no topo da estrutura de defesa, era o ponto cego da elegância gilosiana. Era o único lugar onde a comunicação de força bruta, newtoniana, poderia teoricamente ser forçada a penetrar. O ponto azul estava adjacente à cela de Carr. E o nome Tavian Carr estava associado ao bypass manual. Alina percebeu o que Kane tinha omitido. Aquele sensor array era o único ponto de acesso que a Unified Command não havia conseguido desativar antes da estação se selar. E Tavian Carr, o físico que entendia a lógica sutil gilosiana, sabia de sua existência. Era uma chance microscópica. Uma única transmissão de rádio bruta, disparada no momento exato em que o sensor chilosiano de alta frequência fosse ativado manualmente, poderia ser suficiente para perfurar o campo de isolamento, não pela sutileza, mas pela força de seu ruído eletromagnético. Mas havia um problema. Ativar o sensor de alta frequência exigiria uma sobrecarga de energia que desviaria o fluxo crítico das bombas de ar que Alina estava lutando para estabilizar. A janela seria de 3 segundos. E a ativação só poderia ser feita localmente, perto da cela de Carr. Alina olhou para Kane. Ele estava verificando o status dos filtros de ar, a tensão visível em sua postura. Ele sabia que o tempo estava acabando. Ela parou de digitar. O silêncio na baía era interrompido apenas pelo zumbido fraco das talas em suas pernas. Por que lutar? A dúvida a atingiu com força fria. Você já falhou. Já condenou a todos. Morra em paz. Pare de ser cúmplice. A tentação de apenas aceitar a derrota e deixar a exaustão consumi-la era esmagadora. Era a única certeza que restava. A anulação. Mas ela olhou para Carr, o comandante algemado. Ele levantou a cabeça. Não olhou para Alina, mas para o ponto azul no buffer de memória que ela ainda estava projetando na tela de manutenção. Carr percebeu. Aquele olhar não era de súplica, mas de desafio silencioso. Era a última chance de expor a verdade, mesmo que custasse a vida de todos no processo. Alina não podia aceitar a derrota. Não quando havia um último pedaço de engenharia vulgar para executar. Alina respirou fundo, ignorando a dor lancinante nas pernas. Ela não tinha mais medo, nem culpa. Apenas uma necessidade fria e profissional de corrigir um erro de design. Mesmo que fosse fatal. Ela tocou na tela, ignorando as linhas de código de Kane, e acessou o terminal de transferência. Ela tinha 3 segundos para iniciar a sobrecarga e enviar o sinal. Alina apertou o comando de ativação manual do High Band Sensor Array. O Command Hub foi instantaneamente engolfado por um alarme estridente, não o alarme tático de Kane, mas uma sirene shailosiana antiga e grave. A luz branca piscou em vermelho furioso e o mapa de fluidos que Kane estava monitorando estourou em uma cascata de erros catastróficos. Alina havia desviado energia crítica. Vesper, o que você fez? Kane rugiu virando-se, o olhar de cálculo substituído pela fúria de um sistema violado. Tavian Carr, ainda algemado, sorriu pela primeira vez em dias. E então, as talas em suas pernas, o metal que o mantinha prisioneiro, explodiram com a sobrecarga de energia, o estrondo abafado ecoando pela baía. Ele estava livre, mas o preço era claro, a estação estava à beira do colapso total. Alina não tinha apenas iniciado um sinal. Ela tinha iniciado a contagem regressiva para a falha completa de vida. O alarme shilosiano não era um som. Era uma onda de choque de baixa frequência que vibrava através da estrutura óssea de Alina. O Command Hub foi inundado por uma luz pulsante de emergência, alternando entre o vermelho furioso da sobrecarga e o branco estéril da baía de engenharia. Os painéis de dados que antes exibiam a estabilidade da prisão, agora se transformavam em rabiscos furiosos, o mapa de fluidos quebrando em uma cascata de falha total. Kane girou, o brilho frio de seu olhar se quebrando sob o impacto da violação. Sua fúria não era emocional. Era a reação de um sistema lógico quebrado. Alpha 7, neutralize Carr. Vesper, solte o terminal agora. Carr, no entanto, já estava em movimento. A sobrecarga de energia que explodiu suas talas também lhe deu um timing impossível. Ele não correu para Kane. Correu para o ponto azul no console de manutenção que Alina havia exposto, o High Band Sensor Array. Ele era um físico, não um soldado, mas se movia com a urgência desesperada de um homem que entende a natureza do tempo. Alina não podia se mexer. A dor a estava transformando em um bloco de gelo queimado, mas ela estava ancorada ao console pelas talas quebradas. Ela usou essa imobilidade como alavanca. Sua mão direita, ainda ligada ao terminal de transferência que ela usava para desviar a energia, não digitou novos comandos. Ela a usou para estabilizar a frequência de ruído que seu IMP havia gerado. Ela não estava tentando enviar um sinal limpo. Estava tentando enviar barulho, a força bruta do caos newtoniano, através da elegância sutil shilosiana. Alpha 7, Kane rosnou correndo em direção a Carr. Alpha 7 reagiu com a disciplina treinada. O soldado não sacou a arma. Ele se moveu para interceptar Carr, usando seu corpo blindado como um escudo, forçando o comandante para longe do terminal. Carr colidiu contra o vidro temperado da baía de Alina. 3 segundos, Alina. Você sabe a frequência. Carr gritou, sua voz abafada pelo vidro, mas amplificada pela sirene. Alina assentiu. Uma confissão de dor e determinação. Ela sabia a frequência. A única banda de rádio suficientemente baixa e destrutiva, vulgar, para penetrar o isolamento shilosiano. A frequência de rádio de emergência do próprio comando unificado. Kane a alcançou. Ele não tentou nocauteá-la. Ele tentou desconectá-la do terminal usando a força para arrancar os cabos do console. Você tem 40 horas de vida no máximo, Vesper. Seu martírio não serve a ninguém. Kane gritou. Não é martírio. Alina sibilou, puxando os cabos para si, sentindo a corrente de choque passar por seus braços. É ação e reação. Sua missão falhou, Kane. E agora você vai pagar o custo. Ela estava perdendo a força. Kane, com sua vantagem física e seu traje militar, estava vencendo a disputa de tração. Ele conseguiu arrancar a conexão de transferência de sua mão esquerda, mas ela não precisava de cabos para transmitir. Ela precisava de Kane. Alina, com o máximo de força que suas pernas paralisadas e seu tronco esgotado permitiam, impulsionou seu corpo para frente, não para longe de Kane, mas em direção a ele. O impacto foi mínimo, mas suficiente para quebrar o equilíbrio de Kane, forçando-o a dar um passo para trás. Essa desvantagem momentânea foi tudo o que Carr precisava. Livre do aperto de Alpha 7, Carr se atirou contra o sensor Array, não com a intenção de ativá-lo, mas de destruí-lo, com uma sobrecarga final. O sensor shilosiano era o ponto cego da elegância. Carr o transformaria em um megafone de força bruta. Carr agarrou um cabo de energia solto, o mesmo que alimentava as bombas de ar que falhavam, e o conectou ao High Band Sensor Array. O resultado foi instantâneo. O sensor, projetado para recepção sutil, não aguentou o choque. Em vez de transmitir uma mensagem clara, O Command Hub vomitou uma explosão bruta de ruído eletromagnético, uma transmissão de rádio vulgar, saturada de estática e informações criptografadas, disparada através do campo de isolamento. Era o equivalente cósmico a um grito gutural. Transmissão iniciada. Mas a que custo? O ruído eletromagnético atingiu o Command Hub como uma onda física. As luzes da baía de engenharia estouraram em uma chuva de vidro quente. O console principal de Kane, o centro de seu controle, explodiu em faíscas. A sirene gilosiana parou com um craque seco e definitivo. Alina fechou os olhos. Quando os abriu, a baía estava imersa em uma escuridão quase total, iluminada apenas por pequenos monitores de emergência. A eletricidade no ar cheirava a metal queimado e ozônio. O silêncio era aterrorizante. O som das bombas de ar havia desaparecido. Para sempre. Carr estava caído ao lado do sensor array destruído. Seu corpo estava tremendo violentamente devido ao choque elétrico da sobrecarga. Alpha 7, atordoado, moveu-se para checar o comandante. Kane estava de pé. Seu uniforme, antes imaculado, estava agora rasgado e chamuscado pelo pulso eletromagnético. Ele se moveu para o terminal de dados ainda fumegante, ignorando Alina. Status da transmissão. Kane ordenou, sua voz baixa e controlada. A raiva substituída pela lógica implacável do controle de danos. A tela piscou. Sinal de broadcast aberto. Duração 0. 82 segundos. Conteúdo. Fragmentado. Apenas códigos de identificação e coordenadas de setor transmitidos, sem detalhes operacionais. Kane assentiu, uma aceitação fria da derrota parcial. Suficiente para atrair atenção. Insuficiente para incriminar. O comando unificado tem tempo para reagir. A Ethelred continua isolada. Ele se virou para Alina, a expressão de um juiz que acabou de ditar a sentença. Você me forçou a desmantelar a tecnologia que você desprezava, Vesper. Eu usei seu cinismo e você usou minha certeza. O resultado, o Ethelred, está agora permanentemente isolado e inabitável. Não temos mais água potável. E você garantiu que o Power Core Bypass, a única fonte de energia que eu tinha para manter o ar, fosse irrevogavelmente danificado pela sua transmissão vulgar. Alina olhou para o console. A contagem regressiva de 40 horas para a desidratação havia terminado. A falha do filtro de ar era terminal. A phase coupling gilosiana. O isolamento. Alina tossiu, sentindo o ar seco arranhar sua garganta. O que acontece se as bombas de ar pararem completamente? Entropia, Vesper. Em poucas horas, o circuito de ar em colapso causará um aumento de pressão interna nos reservatórios residuais, que agora estão vazios. Sem o contrapeso de um sistema de suporte de vida funcional, a estabilidade estrutural da estação será comprometida, Kane explicou, sua voz puramente didática. Sua terceira lei, Vesper. A cada ação, sobrecarga de energia, uma reação igual e oposta, colapso estrutural. Você não destruiu apenas a tecnologia. Você condenou a estação inteira. O que ela havia salvado há 72 dias da aniquilação imediata, ela havia condenado à implosão lenta hoje. Alpha 7 se aproximou, arrastando o corpo inerte de Carr. Comandante Kane? Carr está comprometido. E a contagem regressiva para a despressurização é de 2 horas. O circuito de ar está em colapso terminal. 2 horas, não 40. Ela havia acelerado a morte em 20 vezes. Kane olhou para o corpo de Carr. O corpo dele não é mais um recurso. Ele cumpriu sua função. Ele se voltou para Alina. Sua derrota parecia completa. O comando unificado sobreviveria à exposição parcial e a Ethelred morreria. O pragmatismo de Kane parecia ter prevalecido. O que resta a fazer, Vesper? Kane perguntou quase com pena. Você tem 2 horas. Você pode usar seu tempo para tentar retardar o colapso, para salvar algumas vidas em uma cápsula de fuga, ou você pode aceitar a entropia. Alina não respondeu. Ela olhou para as telas que mostravam os setores de moradia, as luzes piscando em vermelho. Ela tinha exposto Kane, mas ao custo de toda a colônia. O vazio de sua vitória era um peso físico. Ela notou então que Carr, apesar da eletrocução, ainda segurava algo em sua mão. Não era o cabo. Era um pequeno drive de dados. Alpha 7 se abaixou para pegá-lo. Não, Alina disse, a voz rouca. Não toque nisso. É um gilosiano. Pode ser um detonador. Kane hesitou. Ele não tinha medo de morte, mas tinha medo de dados perdidos. Ele gesticulou para Alpha 7 se afastar. Alina usou o último resquício de força em seu corpo, a adrenalina da dor final, para alcançar o corpo de Carr através da abertura no vidro temperado. Kane observava incerto sobre a ação. Ele viu apenas uma mulher quebrada e desesperada tentando recuperar algo que a confortasse. Alina agarrou o drive. Não era um detonador. Era um microdrive chilosiano, e no momento em que ela o tocou, ele acendeu. O diagrama que se projetou no ar frio da baía não era de defesa nem de propulsão. Era um diagrama de contingência, codificado em lógica gilosiana pura. O drive continha uma única solução para o colapso estrutural causado por falha no sistema de suporte de vida. O diagrama mostrava o reator principal do Ethelred, o reator que eles supunham estar inoperante. Mas o reator não estava desligado. Ele estava apenas em modo sleep, aguardando uma ativação baseada em um princípio que Alina, a fã de Newton, nunca teria considerado. Cura via inversão de campo. O diagrama mostrava que, se a estação estivesse em colapso terminal, o que estava, o único caminho para a recuperação estrutural era inverter momentaneamente o campo de energia do The Cloister, usando o poder da própria prisão para selar as rachaduras estruturais. O problema? A inversão do campo exigia uma quantidade massiva de massa de reação, 10 vezes mais do que o gelo que Alina havia vaporizado. Era impossível. Alina olhou para o drive. Havia uma nota de rodapé no diagrama, escrita em caligrafia humana, reconhecível como Tavian Carr. Se a massa for zero, o sistema pode aceitar massas residuais orgânicas como último recurso para o impulso inicial. Alina compreendeu. A lógica elegante dos chilosianos, que buscava escapar da massa, tinha um protocolo final de emergência. Se falhasse, usaria a massa mais abundante e condenada, os próprios habitantes. Carr não apenas ativou o sinal. Alina sussurrou, a voz cheia de horror. Ele nos deixou o manual de instrução para o último sacrifício. Kane, que estava lendo o diagrama sobre o ombro de Alina, interpretou o dado com clareza brutal. O sistema está nos dizendo para usar a biomassa do habitat como combustível de reação, Vesper. Para salvar a estrutura, devemos sacrificar um percentual da população restante. A física deles não se submete à sua moralidade. Não, Alina disse, fechando o drive. Não é a única massa. Ela olhou para Kane. Ele era a certeza da força bruta, o único elemento que sempre obedeceu à terceira lei. Ele era a massa necessária. Kane, Alina disse, sua voz firme. Você veio aqui buscando a certeza. Você me usou porque eu só confio em Newton. Agora você vai pagar o preço newtoniano final. Ele hesitou, entendendo o que estava implícito no diagrama. O reator precisava de uma explosão de massa orgânica para a inversão. E ele era o elemento mais apto a fornecer energia na forma de um corpo bem nutrido e blindado. Você não pode me forçar, Kane disse, levantando seu rifle a laser. Não preciso, Alina respondeu, a dor e o medo dando lugar a uma aceitação fria e profissional. Você está aqui para preservar a missão, e a missão falhou. Mas se o Aethelred implodir, a tecnologia chilosiana será perdida para sempre. Você pode salvá-la, Kane. Você pode se tornar o impulso de reação que garante a estabilidade. Kane atirou. O feixe de energia atingiu o console de controle de fluidos de emergência, o único sistema que restava. Ele não atirou em Alina. Ele eliminou a última variável que poderia prolongar a vida da colônia. Era um convite para o ultimato. Se você me matar agora, Vesper, Kane disse, sua voz tensa. O Comando Unificado nunca saberá que a fase 2, a recuperação estrutural, era possível. Alina sorriu, um movimento fraco, mas genuíno. Ela tinha vencido a discussão de física. Você não me entende, Kane, Alina disse, ignorando a dor paralisante. Eu não sou uma heroína. Eu sou uma engenheira de salvamento. Eu conserto sistemas falhos. E você, Kane, é o último componente que resta para a solução. Seu corpo é o último quilo de massa que obedece à lei. Você é a certeza. Ela ativou remotamente o protocolo de emergência, forçando a baía de engenharia lateral a se isolar do resto do Command Hub. O vidro temperado desceu com um clangor final. Alpha 7 gritou, preso com o corpo de Carr do lado de fora. Kane estava preso com Alina do lado de dentro. À porta do reator, Alina instruiu, projetando o caminho no visor de Kane. Você pode atrasar a implosão por horas, se o Power Core Bypass for acionado com a massa certa. Kane hesitou, olhando para a rota. Ele podia matar Alina e tentar atrasar o colapso, ou ele podia aceitar a equação. Ele escolheu a equação. O sacrifício era lógico, se garantisse que a tecnologia chilosiana sobreviveria à implosão. Vesper, Kane disse, baixando o rifle. Você é a única pessoa que eu já conheci que entendeu perfeitamente o preço da certeza. Nós dois seremos sacrificados para provar que a física newtoniana no final sempre vence. Ele se moveu para a porta do reator. Alina assistiu. Ela não sentiu triunfo, apenas a satisfação amarga de completar um circuito. Ela não tinha salvado a todos, nem se redimido. Ela apenas tinha escolhido o último, mais doloroso ato de engenharia: transformar um homem em combustível. Kane entrou na câmara. Alina digitou o último comando: ativação do Power Core Bypass. O reator chilosiano, dormente por décadas, acordou com um ruído baixo e voraz. A luz na baía de engenharia se tornou esmeralda. Alina fechou os olhos, esperando a detonação da massa orgânica. Mas a explosão não veio. Em vez disso, o Command Hub estremeceu com um som de aço dobrando sob pressão, o som de rachaduras estruturais se fechando. O campo de isolamento chilosiano se inverteu. O Command Hub ficou em silêncio. Alina abriu os olhos. O reator havia aceitado o impulso. A estrutura estava estabilizada. O isolamento de The Cloister agora era uma barreira permanente, impossível de ser quebrada por dentro ou por fora. Kane não estava morto. Ele estava de volta, ofegante, ensanguentado, mas inteiro. O reator não o havia vaporizado. O reator me rejeitou, Kane disse, sua voz um misto de descrença e fúria. Massas blindadas são inadequadas para ignição primária. É a elegância gilociana novamente, Vesper. Eu não era vulnerável o suficiente. Eles desprezaram até o meu sacrifício. Mas ele não estava sozinho. Kane havia trazido algo de volta da câmara do reator. Não um pedaço de tecnologia, mas um pequeno cilindro metálico preso ao seu cinto. Era o drive de dados que Carr havia segurado. Você falhou, Vesper. Duplamente, Kane disse, sua voz fria e triunfante. A estação está selada para sempre. E eu tenho o drive de Carr, a última peça da tecnologia chilosiana. Alina olhou para o drive. O drive que continha a solução para o Power Core Bypass. E o drive que Kane havia roubado de Carr momentos antes de prendê-los. O que Carr tinha em suas mãos era uma isca. Kane sorriu. A expressão do pragmatismo vitorioso. Ele sobreviveu. Ele tinha a tecnologia. A exposição parcial podia ser contida. Mas então Kane tossiu. Não um pigarro, mas um som profundo vindo do fundo de seus pulmões. Sangue escuro subiu à sua boca. O quê? Ele começou. Você não me entendeu, Kane. Alina sussurrou, sentindo a dor nas pernas diminuir para um torpor. Eu não precisava que o reator o aceitasse. Eu precisava que ele o rejeitasse com força. Choque de retorno, Kane. O reator chilosiano não te mata. Ele te envenena com radiação. A camisa de Kane estava encharcada de sangue. O choque de rejeição do reator chilosiano havia garantido que a única pessoa a entender e controlar a tecnologia fosse permanentemente incapacitada. Vitória. Vazia. Kane sussurrou, caindo de joelhos. O comando unificado. Virá. Não, Alina respondeu, aceitando o silêncio. O sinal foi fraco, Kane. E o reator inverteu o campo. Ninguém virá. Nós estamos presos. Para sempre. Você não perdeu a missão. Você garantiu a reclusão perfeita. Por sua causa, a Ethelred é o túmulo de todos nós. Ela não sentiu alívio, apenas a conclusão. Ela era uma técnica e tinha completado o projeto, mesmo que o projeto fosse o fim. O corpo de Kane desabou. Alina estava sozinha na escuridão fria, as pernas quebradas, o ar acabando, o silêncio perfeito do isolamento completo. Mas o sinal fragmentado tinha sido enviado. Alguém na vasta escuridão poderia ter interceptado. Alina estendeu a mão, tocando o vidro temperado. A única coisa que restava era a contagem regressiva. Mas ela não estava mais lutando contra a culpa. Ela tinha feito a escolha mais brutal e pragmática que podia. Se ela tivesse sorte, alguém veria o sinal. Mas a única certeza que restava era o silêncio. E a certeza, ela sabia, era sempre o mais difícil de suportar. Ela tinha vencido a guerra de física, mas tinha perdido a batalha por misericórdia. E agora, ela tinha 2 horas para decidir o que fazer com a vitória. The silence following Kane's collapse was not the passive vacuum of space, but the heavy definitive texture of final entropy. The air pumps were gone. The command hub was a tomb illuminated by the faint, angry red glow of emergency monitors. The vibration, the metallic groan that had protested the violence of being moved, was now completely, irrevocably absent. Alina lay paralyzed against the ruined console, her legs mere anchors in the fractured metal. The torpor that had started in her lower body was spreading, a cold welcome numbness settling over the agony of shattered bone and electrical shock. Kane was a crumpled heap of specialized uniform and dead biomass 10 feet away, the ultimate Newtonian cost paid, yet still inadequate. The Xylosian reactor, designed to reject contamination, had simply delivered him a fatal dose of radiation instead of consuming him, ensuring his sophisticated mind and body were removed as a variable, but maintaining the integrity of the power core bypass. She didn't try to move. Movement was futile. Action only guaranteed an equal and opposite reaction, and she had run out of available mass to expel. The time remaining flickered on her broken wrist monitor. 1 hour and 23 minutes until the residual pressure drop compromised the hull integrity. She looked through the tempered glass barrier. Alpha 7 was gone. Either he had died when the glass sealed, or he had dragged Carr's body away before the final pressure drop. It didn't matter. Alina was alone with the consequence. She had secured the station's isolation. Unified Command would never access the technology. The complex, subtle physics of the Xylosians, the non-Newtonian elegance, was now perfectly protected by the brutality of Newtonian certainty. Alina had spent 72 days trying to prevent a bad death, only to guarantee a perfect sealed ending. She hadn't saved the colony. She had simply turned the Ethelred into a mausoleum that operated on physics she understood perfectly. She closed her eyes, accepting the finality. There was no heroism left, only accounting. She hadn't achieved redemption. She had achieved conclusion. Alina slowly worked her hand into the pocket of Kane's uniform, ignoring the sickening warmth of the irradiated blood. She found the data drive Kane had recovered, the final piece of bait Carr had left. It was sleek, alien, and pulsing faintly with energy. Carr, the physicist, knew the value of diversion. He had used the temptation of the final solution to trick Kane into the reactor, removing the military obstacle. Alina didn't attempt to read the drive. The elegance it contained was irrelevant now. She tossed it onto the console. It slid across the metal and came to rest next to the shattered remnants of her manual override panel, the same panel she had slammed 72 days ago, trading the colony's water for its immediate survival. She shifted her gaze back to the main console, seeking any remaining function. Her objective was no longer survival but mitigation. If the implosion was inevitable, she needed to ensure the collapse was clean, controlled, and localized to the command hub, maximizing the remaining breathable hours for the residents in the habitat sectors. Using a crude bypass lever, a piece of salvaged Xylosian wire she had kept taped inside her suit boot for 4 years, Alina forced a connection between the remnant emergency lighting circuit and the atmosphere regulators for the lower decks. The action created a localized short, but it rerouted the final bursts of residual power. The result was immediate. The red lights in the habitat sectors, visible on the monitor, pulsed briefly, then went dark. This didn't restore the air, but it stopped the system from trying to cycle the dead pumps, conserving the remaining atmospheric sealant in the residential areas. It bought them maybe an extra hour of viable air, trading 2 hours of slow even pressure drop for 3 hours of uneven localized containment. This is what I do, she thought, watching the monitors stabilize in their new silent configuration. I delay the inevitable by embracing crude certainty. She remembered Ilara, her mentor who died trusting in the perfection of alien design. Ilara would have condemned this, but Ilara never had to confront the necessity of the zero. Alina knew the difference between noble failure and necessary survival. She was the technician who only trusted what she could smash and rebuild, and now she had salvaged a final cruel calculation from the ruins. She wasn't redeemed by this final act. She was defined by it. She was the one who survived the elegance of theory because she was dedicated to the certainty of failure. This was her victory, the engineering of a controlled demise. Alina closed her eyes one last time. She wasn't calculating trajectories or delta V anymore. She was simply listening to the silence, the absence of the mechanical pulse that used to be the station's heartbeat. She thought of the Xylosians. Their drives failed unpredictably, shifting the station into a slowly decaying orbit. Their logic was that the universe should yield to their will. They sought perpetual motion, fuel-less elegance. Alina had only ever believed in mass and momentum. For every action, an equal and opposite reaction. Her final victory was the ultimate proof of this law. She had provided the final massive action, the destabilization of the structural coupling, and the equal and opposite reaction was the perfect permanent sealing of the cloister. She was the brute force that ensured the elegance survived, untouched and forever unseen by the dangerous universe Kane represented. She had become the final necessary component of the alien defense system. She had been right to trust Newton. The debris field she bypassed 72 days ago was merely the first layer of defense. The second layer was the structural trap she triggered with the EMP. And the final perfect layer was her own desperate choice. The decision to use the last available mass, Kane, as a vector for poison, ensuring no one would ever control the physics of the Ethelred again. No more choices, no more calculations, no more action. The transmission she and Carr had managed to punch through was a fleeting whisper in the void, perhaps too fragmented, too vulgar to be heard or acted upon. It didn't matter. Even if the unified command did come looking, they would find only a permanently sealed, structurally sound yet dead station, forever held in an elegant, isolated orbit. Alina Vesper, the propulsion tech who specialized in salvage systems, felt the cold spreading from her legs. She had used up the last of the available resources, including her own body's ability to fight the pain. The engineering bay grew darker. The thin air tasted of dry metal and final resignation. She was safe, stationary, and terminally dehydrated. The gravity of her choice, the physical weight of her decision, no longer felt heavier than any thrust her improvised engine could generate. It was simply the certainty of mass at rest. The debris field, the threat she had avoided, was long gone. The debris field was now inside. She had 18 seconds to calculate the vector burn. And it was enough. The problem, she understood now, was not the calculation. It was the cost. The end of the reaction, Alina realized, was only this: absolute stillness. And the silence. The final action, the expulsion of the last mass, was complete. The Ethelred shuddered past the debris cloud. Safe for the moment. The final result, however, was inevitable. Alina Vesper waited for the final brutal certainty. The complete absence of momentum. The lack of momentum, finally, was absolute. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in